Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to dip into musical history very casually with a little chat about the rise of the romantic artist hero and the myth thereof. Now, this is a topic that has always interested me. Actually, I did historical work on it because it's still with us in certain strange ways. It pops up now and again, largely in connection with the repertoire that was created by the composers who actually wished that they had been romantic artist heroes. The biggest one of those, the most iconic one of those, was Wagner, of course. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So let's start a little bit earlier in the classical period, when there were no romantic artist heroes. None. Zippo. Composers, as you know very well, were servants or municipal employees. Bach was a municipal employee when he wasn't a servant working for some aristocratic person. Remember, one of Bach's employers threw him in jail because he wanted to quit. So things were a little bit different back then. And the craft of musician was not regarded very highly. Composers were dubious characters. Musicians were dubious characters. They were artists. They were peripatetic. In other words, they moved around. They were rootless. They were immoral. And they were servants, essentially servants, or at best employees. And they were designed to do a job, and they did their job, and their job was ephemeral. I mean, even though we now regard them as having written great masterpieces, they didn't know that they were doing that. Or if they knew it, no one else cared, because music was contemporary music. People were only interested in the latest new thing. They didn't care about what had been written earlier or previously. And so, there was no idea of, the composer as somehow representing something larger than their daily job. But that all began to change in the 19th century. And it changed in the 19th century in connection with nation-state building, political and cultural process in which cultures distinguished themselves in Europe from other cultures, and they did so by virtue of their artistic products and through the various wars and political maneuverings that were going on at the same time. They did this in connection with the creation of cultural products that represented the nation state and represented the nation state in comparison to other products of other nation states that you were supposed to detest. Nationalism was a terribly evil thing historically, and the artistic products of nationalism benefited, if that's the word, from their being associated with specific trends and tastes, especially of the emerging middle classes. That also happened during the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, and all of that stuff was going on. There's a wonderful book by a historian who I happen to know, George L. Mossey, who's a brilliant cultural historian. And he wrote a book called The Nationalization of the Masses, which I've talked about before, which is a wonderful study of how in Germany, particularly because he was German, the government used culture, used music as a force toward greater political unification by creating singing societies and artistic organizations in German towns, which played repertoire custom made for them. And you see it in works like, Raff's First Symphony, An das Vaterland, to the homeland, things like that. And Wagner, of course, took everything to the next level in Bavaria by basically bankrupting the entire state budget to build Bayreuth and to live like a king in a palatial accommodation that crazy King Ludwig II of Bavaria was more than happy to provide, before his own courtiers probably drowned him to get rid of him because he was going to destroy Bavaria on behalf of Wagner. And Bayreuth became the shrine at which the romantic artist hero would be worshipped. It was a cult. And these cults were really powerful. But one of the ways that this cult was created, this cult of the romantic artist hero was created, was by posthumously redeeming figures who should have been romantic artist heroes, but didn't make the grade in their own time because the concept didn't really exist. The most important of those was Beethoven. And the biggest promoter of Beethoven as the romantic artist hero was Liszt, who personally financed a good deal of the Beethoven Monument in Bonn, which was built in time for the celebrations of the centennial of Beethoven's birth. And Beethoven, as a revolutionary, because we know he was, and as someone who didn't get along with anybody, which he didn't, despite the fact that he had great friends in the aristocracy in Vienna, the Viennese aristocracy was amazingly tolerant and respectful of what they regarded as artistic genius. They were a musical crew. And they were willing to put up with a lot to get, great music. So there was some of that. And Beethoven posthumously became the original, the prototype of the romantic artist hero. It was the Eroica with its dedication that was withdrawn to Napoleon, and all of that stuff, became part of the legend of the artist heroes struggling, ceaselessly striving after higher ideals, and in doing so, representing the highest aspirations of the national culture in which he lived. Now, you see, Beethoven didn't really have a national culture in the sense that we know it now, but that didn't matter because he was absorbed into the German national culture of the second half of the 19th century. So these artistic heroes, there were a lot of them. I mean, this is how composers thought of themselves. They began to think of themselves. From a practical point of view, one of the first promoters of the concept of artist hero was actually Ludwig Spohr, a composer who doesn't get a lot of respect today for his compositions. But as an artist, he was a seminal figure, extremely important because he performed, first of all, Beethoven cycles and Mozart things and stuff as if they were these high-level cultural products. He respected them enormously. He didn't really care for Beethoven's music. He thought it was noisy and vulgar. But he recognized the importance of Beethoven as a symbol. He also did a tremendous amount to try and legitimize the profession of artist. Even in his aristocratic employment, he was extremely first of all, his behavior was invariably high-end noble, even snobbish. He would refuse to perform if he didn't think that the aristocracy was paying sufficient attention to what he was performing. He didn't allow for the lower standards that promoted music as mere entertainment, especially among the upper classes. He wanted to educate them. And so his example was an extremely important one, among composers of the day. And he did succeed in raising the level of respect for which, composers and artists were treated, especially in Central Europe during his lifetime. That's why Wagner hated him so much, of course, because he considered him to be a rival, at least in cultural/philosophical terms. Anyway, that was an important element of things. Artists became more respectable because of just simple nuts and bolts, grassroots organizing, if you want to call it. They were no longer treated as just, itinerant servants. That changed over the 19th century. It had to, because otherwise you could never, ever get the concept of the romantic hero representing the nation state in the way that Wagner managed to exploit the concept. So Wagner and Liszt and all those guys, they were romantic artist heroes. Even Brahms, who certainly was not musically in tune with the progressive faction in German art, was extremely conscious of his place in musical history and the need to create a certain high level of musical production, whether it was just in terms of craftsmanship or in terms of the way the music was treated and handled in his lifetime. He was a great classicist as a composer, aesthetically. But culturally, he was one of the first composers to actually make a living as a composer. That was a big deal, a really, really big deal, because he had a comfortable life being supported by his musical production, which wasn't something that most composers could count on. And after that, with the rise of the virtuoso conductors and the virtuoso instrumental geniuses, the Liszts and Paganinis and then Mahler and Nickisch, and they all benefited. They all benefited from the general change in the artistic paradigm that held that people who participated in art were somehow endowed with greater than merely mortal talent and perception. Mahler's reforms in Vienna were legendary. He treated the Vienna Hofoper as the greatest palace of culture in Western civilization, and even the emperor would get shut out if he showed up late to a performance, or if he was talking in his box, and Mahler would stop and glare at whoever was, daring to trespass on the holy sanctity of the artistic realm. That was where our artistic culture largely comes from today. The idea that we sit in silence throughout a concert, that we don't applaud except at appropriate moments. All of those are remnants of that culture. Because, remember, in Haydn and Mozart's day, if people liked something, they applauded right there. They would demand an encore right there. They would talk endlessly, in the middle of things, and chat and do stuff. Concerts were social occasions for the upper class and the wealthy, and they treated them that way. The music was incidental. In Rossini's day, people went to the opera house to gamble at the casino in the foyer of the opera house. The actual opera was an ancillary and incidental entertainment where wealthy gentlemen would go to see their mistresses perform, their aria and then leave. The whole treatment of art was much, much more ephemeral than it became today. I'm not condemning this trend. I think respect for the arts is absolutely deserved. Respect for the talent of these amazing geniuses who created this legacy. Absolutely. But there's a downside. The downside is the cult-like handling of artists, the worshiping of the ground that they walk on, the groupiness of artists. I mean, it's the pop star culture of popular music artists. It's all part of this history, the mythos of the romantic artist hero. And so today, where we live in a much more relativistic time, let's just say, we make our own romantic artist heroes at will, and they strive to become part of that category. That's how we judge artistic success, just about. But there's a long and very interesting history behind the process. I just wanted to mention it. I wanted you to think about it a little bit, perhaps, because it's really extremely interesting, and it to some extent determines our relationship to the arts, to classical music. When I did a video claiming that music is merely entertainment, everybody got hysterical, or a lot of people got hysterical. And they said, well, it's not really entertainment, or it's high-end entertainment, or it's... What's wrong with the word entertainment? Is there anything more noble than being able to sit back, relax, and enjoy something for itself? I think creating entertainment is one of the greatest things anybody can do. It's a uniquely human invention. I don't see my cats entertaining themselves. Actually, well, I do, but it's hunting behavior. You can't say that, going to see, The Marriage of Figaro is hunting behavior, unless you're, out to outdress the person in the box next to you or something like that. But basically speaking, there's nothing ignoble about entertainment at all. But we look at it that way. And the reason we look at it that way is because we have drunk the Kool-Aid of the 19th century. We subscribe to the myth of the romantic artist hero, to the inherent superior value of cultural products, all of which I completely reject, by the way. But it's good to know where it comes from. However you want to feel about it, that's up to you, of course. So that's my treatise for the day. Thank you for joining me. Keep on listening and take care.